When my daughter told me to find somewhere else to die, I felt something inside me break and then become something sharp. I packed a single suitcase with the clothes I had worn for 50 years of birthdays and funerals and walked out of the house I had kept for decades, as if I were an extra in my own life. I was 58, a woman who had cooked Sunday dinners, balanced bills, and believed in promises. 3 days later, I sat in a tidy office across from a lawyer and learned that the account I thought was mine had been emptied, and that my name had been quietly removed from trusts I had helped build. If you are watching, subscribe and tell me where you are watching from. I am going to take you through how a daughter who became suddenly wealthy turned her back, how I went from erased to evidence holder, and how what happened 3 days after that first cruel sentence changed everything. 2 months before any of this, I was Mary Harlan, wife of Daniel Harlan, neighbor of the same corner for 32 years, someone who kept receipts and recipes in the same drawer. I thought loss would be about grieving. I did not yet know it would be about learning to interrogate every signature, every coffee stain on a page, every voicemail with the smell of lemon dish soap in the background. The first time Emma asked me to move out, she smiled with teeth that hid strategy. The woman who made birthday cakes and ironed shirts suddenly felt like a figure from a photograph that someone had decided to crop. I will show you the calls, the receipts, the recording that turned the game, and the legal strategy that made the truth louder than the family name. Stay with me to the end. You will see that the most certain revenge is to take the facts and make them undeniable. I will start with how I became the kind of person someone thought they could replace. I grew up in a small town called Briarfield, where summers smelled of cut grass and engine oil. My father taught me how to read numbers on an odometer and how to spot a bad dollar. I left home at 19 with a suitcase the same color as the curtains and a scholarship that felt like permission. I met Daniel at a library fundraiser, and we married beneath a willow that kept wanting to drop its leaves onto my dress. He worked as an engineer, and I took jobs that people thanked me for because I did them quietly. Our marriage was full of routines. I remember the wooden spoon he always used and how he would whistle when he fixed the leaky faucet. For 25 years, I balanced checkbooks while learning to listen to the cadence of his stories. We had a partnership built of small trust deposits. Then came the cancer diagnosis, and the slow-moving hospital corridors filled with fluorescent light and antiseptic. I became the one who sat with charts and prescriptions. I became the one who signed forms because his hand shook. When he died, the grief was a constant pressure in my chest, and the house felt like a stage where everyone else read their lines and left the scene before I had time to breathe. The first months after Daniel's funeral were a blur of flowers, casseroles, and people saying how sorry they were. Emma arrived for the funeral with a new purse and a way of looking at me that made me feel both loved and measured. In those weeks, strangers hugged me and neighbors offered rides, and a man from the bank named Peter asked if I needed help with the accounts. I said yes to everyone because saying no felt like admitting that I was no longer part of the plan. Those routines of service and small savings that built our life turned out to be the same things someone else counted as opportunity. These paragraphs are not a plea. They are the map that explains why I did not see the first signs that a narrative was being rewritten around me. At Daniel's funeral, there was a moment that still plays in my head like a bad ringtone. The church smelled of lilies and old hymnals. I could taste the salt of my own tears and the metallic tang of fear. Emma hugged me and whispered a line that sounded casual but landed like a verdict. She said, "I can take care of this, Mom. You should rest." Later, over coffee that tasted like burnt sugar, my sister Rachel, who used to call every Sunday, said with forced cheer, "You did so much for him, Mary. You deserve a break." I remember the softness of the chair, the way the sunlight cut the dust in the air, the rustle of bridal tissue paper someone had left in a pew. That night, I found a note in my kitchen in the handwriting I had taught my daughter to make. "Come stay with Jenna for a while," it said, and below it, a number that was not Jenna's. I called. A man with a clipped voice answered. "Are you Mary Harlan?" He asked if I had seen the will. There was no will in my hands then. Instead, there was this sudden interest in documents and a polite pressure to sign temporary forms. The first sign of manipulation was like a cold breeze under a door. It woke me up. The first real pressure came 3 days after the funeral, when Emma stood in my doorway with a paper in her hand and a look of impatience. We spoke in the kind of dialogue that feels like a chess match, where you are not allowed to explain the moves. I remember the carpet scratching my knees as I sat because my legs would not hold me up. Emma said, "You cannot manage the house." I said, "I always have. You know that." She said, "Times are different, Mom, and it is better for everyone if you let us handle the estate." I said, "Daniel and I made choices together." She said, "You have had your time, and our lawyer Laura will help you." I said, "Which lawyer?" She said, "Just trust me." I said, "I do not trust being told to trust." She said, "I am trying to protect you," which felt at once like kindness and a barrier. This exchange could have ended in a cup of tea, but it ended with Emma handing me a small envelope with $200 and a motel reservation for the night, because she told me gently that my presence was becoming awkward when business people visited. Her voice was calm and soft, and the air smelled of lemon cleaner and new leather. In that room, I felt sunlight like an accusation on the photographs. That night at the motel, the neon sign outside blinked and hummed like a poor radio station. The bed smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and something sweet, like strawberry shampoo. I folded the envelope and cried into a pillow that did not know me. The phone vibrated with texts from neighbors that read, "Nice little rest, Mom," and "Take care, we will check in." The next morning, I woke to the sound of rain on the window, a TV blaring morning shows with a host laughing at a joke I did not hear, and a voicemail from a man named Marcus who said he was checking in on behalf of the family trust. He asked me to bring certain documents to a meeting. I felt small and enormous at the same time. Moment one of tension slowed everything down into a series of breaths. I remember sitting in a kitchen that smelled of coffee grounds and lemon and hearing the hum of the refrigerator as if it were a witness. The conversation with Emma was repeated in my head like a tape that would not stop. In the first paragraph, I leaned on the memory of her smile as a weapon, and in the second paragraph, I described the physical sensations that made it impossible to sleep. I thought of Daniel's hands in the garden, rough and steady, and I thought how those hands would never hold a pen again to clarify anything. I decided then that I would not be a character in their rewrite. The tension built into a decision to ask questions. That decision felt heavy and holy at the same time. I called Peter at the bank and asked for a statement. He said, "There is a pending transfer," and the line went cold. I felt the floor tilt. The house no longer felt like a home. It felt like evidence. The scene that followed was cinematic in its banality. I went to a small law office where Wallpad had a vintage pattern and a stack of legal pads awaited the touch of a pen. Laura, Daniel's longtime attorney, sat across from me with glasses perched on the end of her nose and a folder that smelled faintly of dust and ink. We spoke in a careful, layered dialogue that kept circling back to the same sentence. We need to be careful. I said, "Show me where my name is." She said, "There are documents signed, Mary, but I cannot release them without consent." I said, "Whose consent?" She said, "It appears Emma has power of attorney." I said, "But that was never formalized in my knowledge." She said, "It was changed just before Daniel died." I said, "What was he thinking?" She said, "He left instructions." I said, "He loved me." She said, "He loved you in his own way." That exchange had 9 back and forth turns, and every sentence felt like a small incision. Each time she adjusted her glasses, I felt the room tilt further. sensory details remained stitched into the memory the way threads are into fabric. The lighting was soft and yellow. The whir of the copier existed like a throat clearing. The air smelled of old coffee, paper edges were rough beneath my fingertips, and the carpet had a faint pattern that made me dizzy. I left the office with photocopies and a numb feeling. I began to investigate. I named people and started making phone calls. I met Jenna Ruiz, a forensic accountant who smelled of peppermint gum and who did not offer small talk. I found Marcus Green, a local investigator with a coarse voice who kept lists in the margins of his notebook. I spoke to Peter at Briarfield National, then to an attorney I found online named Tom Barrett, who specialized in elder financial abuse. Each name was a handle I could pull to unspool a knot. I learned to ask for ledgers, for transfer receipts, for timestamps. The discovery was quiet and detailed. I learned that a series of transfers had been made in the days before and after Daniel's death. The transfers used coded descriptions and were routed through a trust that was newly created and named the Riverbend Trust. That name tested my patience and my disbelief. When I pushed, a woman named Rosa, Daniel's sister, texted that Daniel had wanted to make things easier. Another neighbor, Lydia, sent a voicemail that said, "Mary, you should let the young ones handle this." The chorus of casual kindness felt like a cover band playing while the real music was being rearranged. Moment 2 of tension unfolded when I discovered a set of signatures that did not match Daniel's usual scrawl. I spread pages across the kitchen table under the humming light and compared his old grocery lists to the legal documents. The smell of ink filled the room. My hands shook. I called Jenna and she said, "Send me everything I will look for."
Handwriting anomalies and account routing. I remember the silence after I hung up like a held breath. In 2 short paragraphs, I revisited the sensation of flipping pages and the slow unraveling of trust. The discovery was precise and surgical. Each mismatch felt like a betrayal stitched into paper. I decided I would not leave this alone. I will not gloss over the next stretch because this is where the story flips and the evidence begins to speak. I scheduled a meeting with Laura that changed the tone from negotiation to challenge. The room had a brass plaque that said Harlan and Partners and a plant that clung to life in a bright corner. Laura read aloud from a document in a voice that was neither cold nor kind. She read a clause that transferred discretionary distributions to a new fiduciary and named Emma as primary beneficiary. I said, "Where is my name?" She said, "It was removed." I said, "On what authority?" She said, "It appears to have been signed." I said, "By whom?" She said, "The signature matches Mr. Harlan." I said, "Then how can you explain the notation that an amendment was executed in a hospital room with witnesses?" She said, "We have notarized pages and witness statements." I said, "I want independent verification." She said, "That will take time." The exchange here had 10 turns, and every turn added weight. The sensory details tightened the scene. The clip of air conditioning made a steady hum. The leather chair smelled faintly of polish. The coffee had cooled into something flat. The sunlight on the plaque felt like an accusation, and the paper edges crinkled as if in a quiet panic. Outside the window, a delivery truck rumbled by. Inside, the clause hovered like a promise with its teeth bared. Moment 3 of tension is when I played the recording I had begged to obtain. I had found a voicemail on an old phone Daniel had kept in the second drawer. The message had been overwritten and then recovered by Jenna. Its sound was grainy and small. The recording lasted 3 minutes and 42 seconds. In it, Daniel spoke of worries about money and of people who asked for favors. He named Emma, and he laughed softly in a way that I knew. He said, "Mary, if anything happens to me, do not let them steamroll you." He used the word steamroll, and the tone was both tender and wary. Hearing his voice was like stepping into sunlight and shadow at once. I played it for Laura, who sat very still, and then for Marcus, who repeated certain phrases into his notepad. The recording became a hinge on which the case swung. The existence of that file made the legal picture less tidy for the opposition and more truthful for me. Sensory details here include the thin crackle of the recovered audio, the stale taste of the office air, the paperweight cold under my palm, the faint smell of printer toner, and the weight of a silence that followed the last word. After we listened, Laura folded her hands and said, "This changes our approach." That single sentence felt like a light in a dark room. I inserted the community call to action at the moment when the story had moved past shock, and I needed to build a village around the truth. If you have reached this part of the video, you already know how confusing and lonely it can feel when family and money collide. If this resonates with you, write in the comments yes or no and tell me in a few words what the first sign of trouble looked like for you. Your note will help others see patterns sooner and seek help earlier. Many people used to email me privately, and that made me feel like I was shouting into a well. I want us to learn from each other. Your single sentence could be the sign someone else needs to notice. Thank you for being here. With the recording in hand, we pressed on. Jenna provided a forensic accounting report that boiled down to clear numbers and oddities. The report had 280 words summarizing the core irregularity, and then a table of figures that showed duplicate transfers and a shuffled ledger. In plain language, it said that sums labeled as personal loans were routed as discretionary trust flows and then paid out to an entity controlled by Emma. The report smelled of printer ink and late nights. When I presented it to Laura, she said we had probable cause to request an injunction. We filed for temporary relief to freeze accounts. At that moment, the small town papers began to rumble with a story about a dispute over an estate. Tom, a reporter from the Gazette, called and asked for comment. I told him only that I was pursuing clarity. The media interest felt like a breeze that could either cool or fan flames. Block 5 is where the big reversal happened and where the legal gears began to grind against the family machine. The hearing was in a courtroom whose wooden benches smelled of old polish and lemon oil. The judge was a woman with a measured voice named Judge Alvarez. The gallery had the dull rustle of programs and the soft scrape of shoes. Laura stood and outlined the case, speaking in a voice that was precise and steady. She pointed to the recovered recording and to Jenna's accounting and to a set of witness statements that included Rosa saying she had signed a form she did not fully read. The opposing counsel for Emma, a man named Daniel Price, argued that everything had been executed according to Daniel Harlan's wishes. He used phrases like testamentary capacity and free will, and he did so with a cadence designed to sound technical and dismissive. I watched Emma in the front row. She sat with arms folded and a look I would later learn to recognize as a practiced armor. In court, the evidence sat like chess pieces. At one point, Laura asked for forensic analysis of the signatures and for bank routing verification. The clerk looked up numbers and the room had a hush. The judge agreed to temporarily freeze accounts pending a full review and ordered a handwriting expert to compare signatures. That small order felt to me like a bell tolling for clarity. The court minutes smelled of paper and the click of the stenographer's keys was rhythmic and relentless. Outside the courthouse steps, Tom from the Gazette snapped a photo and asked for a comment. I said, "I am only asking for the truth," and the words landed simpler than I expected. Moment 4 of tension is the space between the injunction and the confrontation with Emma. It contained 2 short paragraphs where I cataloged the loneliness and the adrenaline that kept me awake. I remembered the way a streetlight cast a small rectangle of light on my kitchen table and how the photocopies of transfers lay on top like a map. I wrote notes until my hands cramped and the taste of iron filled my mouth. I called Daniel Price and asked for a meeting prior to the hearing. The call went back and forth with polite legalese and underlying threats. He said, "Settlements save reputations." I said, "I did not want reputation. I wanted fairness." He said, "Fairness has a price." Each exchange tightens the knot.
The scene ended with a promise that Emma would appear and that the signatures would face scrutiny. Those words made the next steps inevitable. When the handwriting expert testified the next week, the air was electric in a quiet way. The expert, Jenna told us, found significant differences between Daniel's earlier signatures and the contested amendments. She explained her findings in plain language and then in technical terms. She said, the pressure points and slant patterns are inconsistent with long-term practice. The bank records matched shifts in routing that coincided with large transfers to a company called Meridian Holdings. A Perito Contabile named Jonathan Price provided a ledger review that showed funds moved through shell companies before reaching Emma-affiliated accounts. The forensic evidence was not a single smoking gun, but a set of linked facts that made a clear picture. The smell of toner and the click of a pen joined into a chorus. I watched as the judge frowned and asked for clarification. Each time the technical witness detailed a transfer, the mood in the room shifted. Laura asked for subpoenas and the judge allowed them. Marcus found an email trail between Emma and a financial advisor named Jenna Park that discussed immediate liquidation. It was as if the house of cards had been built in plain sight and we were finally blowing on it. The big operational move came when federal agents coordinated with local prosecutors to execute search warrants. Agent Collins introduced himself and he said, "We will proceed carefully, and we will need your cooperation." I said, "Do whatever is necessary." The morning of the raid was bright and ordinary. The team arrived with papers and forms and 2 black SUVs. My neighbor Lydia watched from across the street and covered her mouth with her hand. Inside the house, we found hard drives tucked behind photo frames, a ledger in a shoebox, and a small safe with a battery pack. The agents carried boxes with gloves and moved methodically. Marcus stood in the doorway with his notebook. The sound of their shoes on the floor was careful and almost reverent. Later, in an interview room that smelled of bleach and coffee, Agent Collins explained that financial crimes require patience and paper trails. The arrests were not immediate, but the pressure was. The evidence found that day included a digital wallet, emails with transaction instructions, and a USB that contained copies of the disputed amendments. Jenna Ruiz's analysis had already laid the groundwork, and now the physical copies matched the picture. I felt both vindicated and hollow. The people I loved were now subjects in a legal machine I had helped start. I will slow again for the moment of greatest emotional intensity, because details matter. Emma was invited to a meeting and asked to explain certain transfers. She sat across from Marcus and Agent Collins and Laura. Our exchange was not cinematic in the way police shows make it seem. It was a series of questions and half-answers and defensive tones. I asked, "Did you know about these transfers?" She said, "I handled things because I was told to." I said, "Who told you?" She said, "Daniel wanted things simplified." I said, "Did he sign these amendments in front of you?" She said, "He was ill and he asked me to look after paperwork." I said, "Did he ever say, 'Do not let them steamroll Mary'?" She froze and then looked down. The room tasted like copper. The dialogue ran for 10 turns, and each turn felt like testing a bone for fracture. In the end, she asked quietly, "What do you want from me?" I said, "The truth." The admissions were not immediate. What followed was months of legal negotiation, recorded interviews, and, eventually, charges brought by the county for financial abuse of an elder and document falsification. The press found the story irresistible. Tom from the Gazette wrote pieces that were careful and then more pointed as evidence accumulated. The public reaction was a strange mix of pity and outrage, and an intense focus on the idea that money had altered what family looks like. The legal process did not make everything neat. There were hearings with emotions that felt raw and procedural motions that felt engineered to delay. We had days where the bank released a small emergency fund to me, and days where the stress made me shake so badly, and a cup of tea trembled in my hands. The turning point legally came when a forensic report tied electronic signatures to a device in Emma's purse and to an IP address that matched Meridian Holdings operations. That technical detail measured 312 characters in the evidence summary, and it mattered because it linked a digital act to a person and to a corporate conduit. The prosecution offered a plea deal that would require restitution and a suspended sentence if Emma admitted to certain counts. The defense countered with claims about Daniel's capacity to consent and about the complexity of trust administration. In the end, the pressure of documents, recordings, and accounting was heavier than the performance of grief. The courtroom resolution left a residue. Emma accepted a negotiated plea that required repayment, community service, and counseling. She apologized to me in a statement that read awkward on paper but was messy in person. I stood in front of cameras once and said, "I do not want to humiliate my daughter, but I needed the truth." The public attention made the estrangement official. Friends divided. Rosa sent a letter of apology. Peter at the bank testified and described internal failures. Marcus, who had become a reluctant confidant, handed me a list of resources for elders who face financial abuse. Jenna Ruiz continued to consult for other cases and started a small practice that specialized in recovered assets. Tom published a follow-up series on elder abuse that led to a local ordinance tightening oversight for trusts and transfers involving seniors. The consequences were legal and social, and each had an edge. Some people called me brave, and others called me vengeful. I accepted both labels with a new sense that truth was a kind of stewardship. The epilogue is long and must be told in 3 markers because transformation is measured over time. 1 month later, I moved back into a smaller house with a porch that looks toward a maple tree. The air smelled of summer paint, and the carpeted floor had a new pattern. I had a check for emergency living expenses and a soft welcome from neighbors who brought a pie. I began to meet with a counselor named Dr. Patel, who taught me to name my feelings and not only my losses. I started a small journal of evidence and memories and kept Daniel's old watch in a drawer that no longer felt like a locked box. 3 months later, I launched a newsletter called Safe Hands that offered resources for elders and a list of vetted financial advisors. Jenna agreed to contribute guest columns, and Marcus wrote a feature on how to spot red flags. The newsletter grew slowly and then faster as people shared their stories. I also helped create a modest fund with donations to assist those who could not afford forensic accounting up front. The smell of printer ink and coffee in that office became a smell of purpose. 6 months after the verdict, I was able to testify at a community hearing about elder protections. I met families who had similar stories, and we began to advocate for legislative change. The place where I had once felt erased became a platform where my experience could prevent harm to others. The house that was once the scene of a betrayal became a modest base for a mission I had not expected. I will end where I began, with a reflection that is both practical and moral. I was pushed out like trash by people I had given my life to, and that pain is real and continues. But I turned papers, recordings, and witness statements into a different kind of currency. The restitution did not return the years that had passed, but it returned dignity, and it built protections for others. I started to forgive in the way that one prunes a rosebush, not by forgetting the thorn, but by choosing new growth. If this story helped you see a pattern you had not noticed, share it. If you are facing something similar, reach out to a professional and gather documents. If you want to follow more details of how we mapped the transfers, subscribe and I will upload the forensic reports and a step-by-step of what to ask your bank and your legal counsel. The final line is simple and true for me. The best revenge is not to humiliate. It is to become someone your betrayers never imagined you could be.